Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're going to be jumping back into GameMaker and we're going to be working on fleshing out our player's death. Currently the player just vanishes as soon as their health drops below 0. Today we're going to make it properly go through a similar death animation as the enemy does, and we're going to have a little flavor text pop up indicating that the player has died. Our player currently, whenever they collide with the enemy, nothing really happens. The player only ends up taking damage if they are in fact shot. So we can add a collision interaction between the player and the enemy, so whenever they do collide, some damage is taken by the player. Let's go ahead and jump into that first. Here on our player event, I'm going to go ahead and add in another collision event, and this collision is going to be with enemy. We're going to jump into that code momentarily. Before we get to that, there's a couple of things we need to add in for our create event. So I'm going to add in a concept for our player dealing with whether they are invulnerable. They of course have that value set to false, whether they are allowed to take damage, and then the death direction, which is needed for whenever we do our animation. With this in place, let's go ahead and create an alarm. I'm going to go back here, add an alarm 0, and in our alarm event, I'm going to specify, and so this turns off invulnerability, and I'm going to say invulnerable is set to false. What I want here is to create the ability that if the player receives damage, we have a brief window of time in which we do not take any more damage. The logic here is we don't want the player to be immediately overwhelmed by a ton of damage, and so if we receive any damage, we are momentarily invincible. So now if we jump into our collision with our bullet, let's go ahead and update that. In here, we want to check if the player is not invulnerable, then and only then do we take damage. We have screen shake, death direction is other dot direction. This will be used whenever we set up our death animation. And our invulnerable, is set to true. And I set my alarm for, by default, the games run at 60 frames per second, so that means for at least half a second we are invulnerable. In our enemy event, we'll actually end up just copying this code. And here instead, I'm going to specify if the enemy collides with us, we take 5 damage. Screen shake, death direction, invulnerability, alarm, all of that is the same. Now that we have both of these set up, let's go ahead and go back to our begin step and add in the rest of the code to determine how the player death object will react. Rather than destroying the object, in here we're going to change this to be an instance change event, and we're going to change our player to player dead. Now we of course don't have this yet, but we will create it momentarily. We need to specify our direction is equal to death direction. That of course is defined by either the projectile or the enemy that hit us. Then we need to go ahead and set horizontal. Speed is now set to length, direction, X, and we'll do 6 in the direction we were hit. And vertical speed is set to length, direction, Y, and I'll set this to be 4 in the direction that we were hit. -3, just so we can have a little bit guaranteed upward momentum. Then our image X scale will be equal to the sine of our horizontal speed. Now with this, we have the basic layout for the player to begin their death animation. We of course need to go over and actually create a new object for player dead. So over onto the right, I'm going to create another group now that we have a little bit more for our player. And I'm going to move O player into here, and I'm going to create another object. This will be O player dead. I have already created a sprite. You can see up here, O player dead. It is similar to the enemy sprite, in which there's one frame where it's flying and another frame whenever it is falling. So going back, and let's go ahead and select that sprite. The sprite has been selected. In here, most of our code is actually going to mirror a lot of how the enemy dies. We do want to avoid having to repeat ourselves, but we don't want to restrict what the enemy can do versus what our player does. So, especially for those of you that have added more effects to whenever the enemy dies, let's go ahead and create a new parent object. Now that we have so many, we might as well create a new group for parent objects. I'm going to go through and parent pickup in here, and I'm going to create another object, parent death, and this is going to end up having all of, or most of our code from our enemy. I'm going to go ahead and add in a create event. This will end up just copying what our enemy's create event is. And I'm going to go ahead and add in a step event down here. And this will copy what our step event does over here. Now with this, I'm going to end up deleting our events and making the enemy a child of parent death. Then if you want to do anything fancy, you can go in here and then end up inheriting and modifying the event, so that way you can have something unique for the enemy's death. Now over for our player, we're going to inherit from the same parent. There's going to be a little bit we're going to modify in here. So in our create event, we will want to inherit and modify it slightly. So in here, we're going to initialize values. So we're inheriting the parent event, and we're going to add a little bit more to this. I want to have my game slow down, have a slow-mo effect whenever we end up dying. And so we're going to do game speed FPS, and we're going to set the speed to now being 15 frames per second. Then we need to remind with camera that it needs to make sure it follows other, in this case being the now dead player. Now that we've updated everything here, our step event actually needs no modification, so we're good to jump into the game and see what it looks like. And there we go. We've successfully slowed down the game, and we have the enemy dying in the full animation. But we're not done yet. As you notice, the game is permanently slowed down. The game does not restart unless we actually hit our restart button. And notice the game is still in its slowdown state. That is where we're going to do some modifications with some flavor text that I want to pop out whenever the player dies. What I want to do is over in our game, I'm going to make sure that in our restart button, whenever we restart things, we set the speed to correctly increase. So game underscore set speed is set back to 60 game speed frames per second. So now whenever my player character dies, the game will correctly be reset back to 60 frames per second whenever I press R. So that addresses at least that portion. The other portion will come into play with our death text. I want to go ahead and create another item. In here, I'm going to create another object. Text death. This is going to be the text that gets displayed whenever we die. As you might imagine, it's going to inherit most of the code from our previous text object with a couple of changes. We're going to end up inheriting our create event. We're going to leave our step event as is. We're going to override our draw event because we want to change that portion completely. We're going to add in a draw GUI event for where we want our text to actually get displayed. And finally, I'm going to have a destroy event. Let's go ahead and maximize this. In our create event, the only things we're going to end up adding is the default text. This is going to be the message that happens whenever the player has been defeated. In this case, I'm going to say, you died. I'm going to reset length to be equal to the string underscore length of our text. And then we're going to set the X and Y values to be camera get view width divided by 2, and this will be on camera 0. And Y is equal to camera get view height of camera 0 divided by 2. This will initialize everything that we need and set our text to actually be centered on the screen. Our step event, we're not modifying at all. Our draw event, this is just to cancel old draw event. Our parent draw event is actually not needed because the parent draw event does it in respect to the room. We want our text to actually be centered on the screen. So in our draw GUI here, we're actually going to end up copying all of the code that we have in our other object. So if you go back to object text, in the draw event, we actually want to copy all of this and place it inside the code here. This will correctly draw the text, but rather than before where it was centered over the sign, in this case it is centered on our entire screen, thanks to the X and Y being defined by our create event. Finally, in our destroy event, then over in our destroy event, by default with the way the code is worked, in the step event, if the player ends up pressing any key whatsoever, the game is supposed to destroy the text object. What I want to happen is right before we destroy the object, I want to make sure that we set this up so that way it resets speed. And so game underscore set speed is 60, game speed in FPS, and room restart. We're going to end up revisiting this in the future. So now, whenever the text has been completed and the player presses any key, the game speed resets and the room restarts automatically. Now going back to our O player dead, we're going to simply add one more event, step end, and draw text. And here we have the variable done, and this simply checked to see if the player had finally impacted the ground. This was present in our parent death, and so it applies to both the player and the dead enemy. If we are done, I want to tell it to now instance create layer. Now create for us X and Y in our current layer, VO text death. Now let's go ahead and give it a whirl and see if it works. Now when our player dies, it now states you have died. And if I press any key whatsoever, the game resets and everything goes well. We correctly can identify the direction we've been hit at, and assuming we end up making collisions with the enemy, it also deals damage. So everything looks set and good. You can of course change your message. If you don't want this little arrow at the bottom, you're more than welcome to end up resetting it over in our O text, you can in the draw GUI get rid of that little marker if that is not to your liking. But that effectively sets everything up for the player successfully having a death animation and some little flavorful message that appears whenever the player hits a target. But if you have any questions or need any assistance in class, just let me know. Otherwise, that's all for now. I'll see y'all next time. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.